Welcome back, everyone. It's David Stretton-Downes here, and welcome back to the Inside Story podcast, where we host compelling conversations around life's big questions, human endeavor, culture, and truth, and of course, ideas. And of course, that includes meeting amazing people and hearing amazing stories. And today, apart from following, sharing, and subscribing to the Inside Story podcast, you can also be in the mix with hearing from my latest guest, Michael Bryant, known as Mikey Bryant. And it's great to have you on the show, Mikey. And where are you calling in from today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, David. I'm calling in at the moment from Pontardawe, which is South Wales, a very small town just to the north of Swansea. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Some of my time I'm in Wales, some of the time I'm in Liberia, which we'll get onto, I believe.
No doubt, we will definitely be jumping into Liberia. But yeah, the reason I asked where in the world are you? A lot of my guests, well, sometimes we're in a studio, but then a lot of the time we are online like this, and that's the joy of Zoom. People can be anywhere in the world, and so you're in Wales, and so where on the planet are you? You're in Wales, and I'm currently in the northeast of England, calling in from a pretty fresh morning up here in the northeast, but very much looking forward to our conversation. So often, Mike, with our conversations, I ask one of three questions to guests, just to kind of get people kind of attuned, give them a bit of a taste as to who they're speaking to. Of course, they're not going to judge you by the answers to these entirely, but it might give them some little nod as to what you're about, and what you enjoy, etc. So these are not related to Liberia, not related to medical. Nothing. These are just general questions, which are quite fun. So the first one I thought would be good would be who are the two people from history, not alive anymore, that you would want to have dinner with, and why? And we'll start off with that one. Don't think too long about it. Don't think too long about it.
That's a really good one. Where to start? I would love to have dinner with, I think Isaac Newton is one, because I always liked science and the idea of coming up with stuff that's totally original, but also the fact that Isaac Newton was very, very eccentric and kind of wound everybody around him up. And I think it'd be much more interesting to have dinner with someone like that, who's completely very, very clever, but very, very left field and totally on a different wavelength to everybody. It would make it a very, very interesting dinner party. So I'd love to do that. And then the sort of poetic side of me would really love to have dinner with Sylvia Plath. I'm a huge admirer of her poems, and I love just everything that she's written. The images, the metaphors, would just be fantastic dinner conversation. And so very sort of opposite ends of the human spectrum, if you like. But that would be my dinner guests.
No, most certainly fascinating. Yeah, well, I'll let the listeners kind of dwell on what that means to them. But no, that's fantastic. I'd love to hear more about those two people. Obviously, Isaac Newton, I'm very aware of, but fantastic stuff. And the second one, which is certainly an interesting one, is who inspires you and why. And of course, I know a lot of people are inspired by their family and stuff like that. But it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that, and then we'll jump into some chat about Liberia and the world.
Sure. So probably my number one inspiration is a lady by the name of Helen Roseveare, who was a doctor who worked in Congo and DRC for over 20 years. She worked basically setting up hospitals, ended up setting up actually two separate hospitals, both of which are still going today. And the reason I really admire her is whenever people think about these kind of people who go overseas and do medical things or medical missions or whatever, there's usually this kind of almost mystical image about them. But Helen was incredibly honest. And if you ever read anything she's written, it's usually stuff about ways in which she's not quite got things right, and she's misunderstood the culture, and she's had an argument with somebody, and she feels so inadequate. And it's very relatable. And that's what I really like, because you look at her and you think, okay, she's doing this incredible stuff, but she's sort of in the mud, very relatable, and she is somehow getting it done. You look at it, you think, okay, well, that's something that we could do. Like, if I achieve in my life a quarter of what she's achieved, I'll consider that a huge win. But you at least look at that and you think, okay, she's human like everybody else. She's not one of these sort of strange mystical figures who sort of
Totally.
gets everything right and never makes a mistake. So huge fan. And just the medical work she did, the breadth of different procedures and different types of patients, and the compassion that was there, and the way that she just poured into the people there. It's very inspiring. If you ever read any of her books, they're incredible books, very raw, honest books.
I can relate to that in many ways, Mike, in that it's the people, it's the geniuses that are able to connect with human nature on a kind of on a real scale that that
Absolutely.
I think are most yeah, interesting. And I think yeah, that kind of ability to be like, well, actually they're within touching distance of me
Mhm.
understanding them, and kind of being able to relate to them. I think it's amazing. There's of course people on this planet, we probably know many of them that just simply are very much out of a lot of people's reach. You know, you talk about Newton, Einstein. You know, we talk about Elon. Um, they're on a different level, and I think in some ways it's harder to relate to them unless you are you know, a kind of serious, you know, hitting the IQ scale as well. But but yeah, no, really fascinating. Great. Well, Mike, so one of the things I'd love to dig into, and often we when I'm on the show talking to people, firstly just to give people an idea as to how we ended up connecting and being on the show, and I think that would be good for our listeners just to start off with. So I'll kick us off. My parents are currently working in Liberia, and obviously you've spent a lot of time over there as well, and that's how we really connected. I was over there um, in 2024 for a good period of time, around a month, and doing some traveling and documenting some of the work out there. And of course, when I was there, chatting extensively with various people, and there was a name that kept popping up, and it was yours. And so it really led me to go, right. We got to have a further conversation. I've got to know a bit more about this man. So that's kind of how we are here, um, in many respects. But I was fascinated by some of the things I was hearing, stories of you know, some of the work that you've been involved with, and fun, crazy achievements in Liberia and elsewhere. I'm an adventurer, and as well, and it's, you know, pushing boundaries is something that's dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to hear about some of the crazy things you got up to in Liberia and other places in Africa as well. But so that's a bit of context for everyone, and Mike is a medic as well, and yeah, I'd love to hear just a bit more, Mike, now about kind of what your top level background. Let's not go too detailed just yet, but top level background, and how you started your relationship with Africa, and why you started your relationship with Africa, because that's a real common overlap between us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, my relationship with Africa goes all the way back to 1990. So when I was 5 years old,
Wow.
yeah, my parents were working in a country called Senegal. So our whole family moved out there. My mum and dad were teachers. They signed up to serve at a missionary children's school. And so myself at age 5, my two brothers aged 3 years and 3 months, all of us moved out there and actually ended up living there. It was supposed to just be a couple of years, but ended up staying there until I was nearly 16. So the majority of my childhood was in Senegal in Africa. So that really shaped everything. I mean, that's where I made the decision to become a doctor. That's where all those kind of things happened. And I came back to the UK, got got through medical school, had a couple of years working, just foundation jobs as they call it here, and then went
Was
up to
that in
Liverpool.
Wales? Was that in
That's
Wales?
Yeah, that
Like
was
yeah,
in Wales. And then went up to Liverpool, which is kind of what you do if you want to do work in Africa. There's a tropical medicine training diploma course that you do. So I went and did that. And from there, kind of jumped into serving in Sierra Leone. So served there for a couple of years with an organization called Mercy Ships. It was kind of a bit strange because the Mercy Ships were actually setting up a hospital in Freetown on land. So ended up spending a couple of years in there. And the hospital, by the time I got there, was already fairly well established. So I worked in the pediatric department there. And while I was there, that transitioned to be under an organization called Freedom from Fistula. Great organization. I worked there for a bit and then came back, did my GP training, did a bit more pediatric sort of subspecialization over here. And then during Ebola time, towards the end of it, went out again for a few months to basically kind of restart that hospital I'd been in before. A lot of it shut down during Ebola, so a team of us went in to restart. It was back in 2015. Then had another year in the bush in Sierra Leone. That came to an end, and in January 2019, ended up in Liberia. So that's how it all got started, and really
Wow.
couple of we actually had my wife and I had 2 years in Liberia together where we were just working at the Elwa Hospital, and since then there's been a little bit more in and out.
Fantastic. Wow. I mean, so much to dig into, and we're gonna do that shortly. But just you mentioned about your family there, Mike, for our listeners. So you're married and you have a son as well, which I know is part of this story as well. So I'm excited to hear more. But is that correct? Those details before we
Yeah,
move on?
so I have a son and also a
Fantastic.
little girl as well,
Great.
Chloe.
Great.
Chloe's first birthday was actually on Tuesday, 6 days ago.
Wow.
So we had a big birthday celebration for her this
Great.
weekend. So it's fantastic.
Great. Well, so you've been dancing around West Africa for quite a few years since
Yep.
1990, and that's amazing. Very similar. Actually, hearing your story, it's very similar to um, my upbringing. Me and my family were based in Ethiopia for 10 or 12 years, and we came back around just before 1990. So 98 I think or 96, and yeah, so very formative. I can relate to that totally. That we, that does change you when you're growing up, having had that upbringing, and yeah, it certainly shaped me in terms of the kind of involvement I have with Africa now and relationship. We often talk when I'm traveling Africa. People often say, "Oh, so where are you from?" I said, "I'm just a son of Africa," and then sub to that,
Okay.
I've lived a lot of time in the UK,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
it is great. So you were based in Senegal, and then you were, yeah, of course, your involvement with Mercy Ships as well. How did you know when you were younger that you wanted to be a doctor? How was that? How did that come about? Like, were your parents medics
Mm.
as well?
No, so my parents weren't. There were a number of things. I mean, I think from quite a young age, we were living in a village at the start in the south of Senegal. And I remember a lot of the time, children in the village would get sick, would have snake bites, would have accidents, all these kind of things. And there was so little medical care available for them. I just remember feeling, even as a little sort of 7, 8 year old, really quite kind of upset and heartbroken by that. And then it really came into kind of focus when I was 12. It was 1997, so you can probably tell how old I am now. In south of Senegal, kind of erupted into this civil war. It was originally it had been sort of low-level guerrilla warfare, but then it all kicked off, and our family and a lot of people ended up being evacuated. A lot of Senegalese people ended up leaving the south and moving to Dakar, which is the capital. So
Hmm.
we set up there, and we ended up living in a much more rundown facility in a very small town just outside of Dakar. And a lot of people got sick. There was an illness that was going around the place that we were living. It was a kind of tick-borne thing that I know about now, having studied it. And it was on these rats. There were all these pack rats running around, huge animals, bigger than cats. And they were unknown to us at the time. They carried this tick-borne illness, and loads of people got sick. And my youngest brother, Peter, he was 7 at the time. He got really sick. He had encephalitis and ended up being admitted into hospital in Dakar and was in there for weeks and was really sick. I mean, he was in a coma at one point. It was We weren't even sure he was going to make it. And thankfully he did. And I just remember the care that he received and the compassion and everything, and thinking, well, this is great because our family has been able to get him help. But what about all the children kind of back in the village? What about everyone else in this town who's never going to be able to access that kind of care? And shouldn't we be doing something about it? Shouldn't we be thinking about it? So really from there, that's when I kind of got my head down. So I'm going to make
Yeah.
some serious effort to study a bit here and kind of apply effort really from there. So most of it kind of started in that small moment,
Phenomenal.
really. Yeah.
Phenomenal. Just jumping back to just jumping back to the thing that jumped out at me, apart from the amazing kind of case study of that child that you were sharing about. One of the things that jumped out to me was that you talked about the size of these rats. Like, sorry, you're saying bigger than cats. Are these like, if I was in the studio now, I'd be saying, like, guys, let's get this up on screen and let's see them. Do you guys have like pictures and stuff of, like, do you think these are around still, or are they in the
Um,
wild, or?
I mean, you'll still find them in that part of Africa.
Wow,
We just call them pack rats because they go around in
wow.
packs. And we used to, I mean, as kind of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys, we would just kind of hunt them and sort of kill them off. And I think we had a suspicion at the time that they weren't healthy and weren't good. And by the time, I mean, we managed to get them out of our neighborhood. By about 2 years of living there, we'd pretty much got rid of them all. But we didn't really realize until a lot of people were sick that what they were actually carrying. So, and looking
Yeah,
now, having with the medical knowledge I have, it's quite concerning just to think, well, there are entire communities, slum communities in particularly, I mean, Freetown, where I worked in
oh,
2012, we started an outreach into a community that's exactly has much even worse sanitation than what we were living through. And loads of those children get the same stuff, and they've been totally no way to deal with the rat problem at this time. So,
it's crazy, isn't it? Because in a lot of these countries, I know that they have, obviously there's the circle of life, there's a predatory order, and larger animals would kind of take control of them, snakes, etc., and other things. But I guess in a city, that's something where there's not really those kind of animals around. So in a city, and I'm not here saying in a city, as in I'm saying in a city, there's not really those types of animals that are going to control that. So I wonder how that's controlled. It must just run ravage, across an area, an urban area.
yeah, I mean, it depends. A lot of it's seasonal, very, very difficult to control. And yeah, I mean, that particular part of Dakar was pretty bad, I think we realized. But I mean, there are ways of dealing with it. I mean, I think the situation has definitely improved quite a lot. And when you look at
Yeah.
Dakar now, I mean, Dakar is a totally different place. And this is 1997, 98. So you look at Dakar now, and it's really quite well developed, and
Mm.
it doesn't have anywhere near that kind of problem. And I mean, Dakar is actually a beautiful city. I would
Yeah.
love going to Dakar. It's incredible, and the people there are just phenomenal. I mean, very interesting, colorful, exciting, warm, friendly people. So,
Yep.
I mean, really a testament to their resilience that things have improved hugely since then. But that was kind of what sort of led me into the medical
Amazing.
profession, really.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because these West African countries, so many of them have. You talk about the civil war there in Senegal, and so many of them, certainly Sierra Leone, and then Liberia, of course, as well. And there's so much tragedy and difficulty in their history from war, isn't there? Both internally and externally. And so I think it's with that on top of the, coupled with the, Ebola and other diseases that are just rife and have been rife in those areas. Just it has hugely impacted that west coast, hasn't it? And we'll talk a bit about kind of Liberia in a minute. And yeah, just some of the stats that I was really hit by when I was visiting there, just in 2024, just in terms of the median age and kind of the impact of war on that country from an education point of view, then knocking on to that, how that's impacted the health and the kind of impact of the country. It is really staggering, and I'm really interested to hear
Yeah.
your thoughts on that as well. But you before we move on, you mentioned Mercy Ships, of course, a phenomenal organization, and actually, yeah, know a lot of people who are on there, and obviously, Leo
Fantastic.
Chang, various other people have been involved with
Mm.
Mercy Ships, and obviously there's Keith Chapman who started the dental center
Mhm.
in Elwa, I know, in Monrovia in
Yes.
Liberia. And yeah, so what was your experience on the ship? Were you kind of doing surgery for a 2 week period, for different stints, and was that with your wife as well?
Sure. So my experience was actually very different and predominantly wasn't on the ship. So
Okay.
the way it worked is I went out to Freetown directly to the little children's and women's hospital there. It's now been renamed the Aberdeen Women's Centre, and I basically lived on land in that hospital. So my I'm probably not a great example of a mercy ship, sir, because I was barely on the ship. The ship arrived February 2011. It was as incredible as
Hmm.
the African Mercy. It's an incredible moment of this beautiful ship arriving and the hope, and all these surgeries were done. It was absolutely phenomenal. They had a 10-month service there, but I only went on the ship for visits. I was
Hmm.
mostly based in the hospital on the land. But in terms of
Okay.
that experience, I mean, it was fantastic. That hospital was something that mercy ships don't normally do, certainly weren't at that time, which is to establish a land-based presence. And there was the hospital there does basically three things, and it's still going strong now. It's just under a different group. But there's the fistula surgery, which is for women with childbirth injuries, which is just magnificent. I mean, there's nowhere else in Sierra Leone doing it anywhere near that standard. There's a brilliant maternal unit, which actually has the best maternal outcomes in Sierra Leone. And then there's outpatient pediatrics, which is where I worked, which was a 5 day a week, incredibly busy, lots and lots of children coming through the doors, lots of them very sick, brilliant experience. And then towards the end of my time there, we started out, it was just sort of 3 days a week, and we expanded up to 5. We managed to onboard more staff. And then we set up an outpatient feeding program, and then an HIV TB program kind of tumbled in on the back of that. But yeah, it was a great experience. The really well supported through the organization. I like the model of doing things. There's a lot of different models of doing medical mission, but one of their strengths is that people are when you go out there, it's very clear what your role is. And I was able to come in and not worry about certain things that I stress about in Liberia. So, for example, I didn't worry at all about the budget. That was just on another planet. I didn't worry necessarily even about inventories or ordering, or I just didn't have to worry about that. I was there purely to be a doctor and then to train local staff. And that was just there. All the other
Yeah,
bits and pieces that I have concern over in Liberia, I didn't have to worry about. So in many ways,
yeah.
it was a good kind of entry point. And then when Freedom from Fistula took it on, my actual role didn't really change. It was just carrying on doing the same thing,
Great.
except slightly different management, but operationally nothing changed.
I think that's one of the things with the differences between, of course, Mercy Ships, which is a huge global organization. For those who don't know, Mercy Ships is essentially a medical hospital, or medical hospitals that are essentially towns on the sea. And currently 2 ships in operation: Africa Mercy and the Global Mercy, one in Madagascar and one in Sierra Leone, Freetown. And yeah, of course, both of them have very much the same premise, but serving 2 very different areas of the world. And I think the thing that I love about Mercy Ships as well is, of course, it's the preparation on land, and the kind of I know there's the Hope Center now in Freetown as well, and these other operations that support the stuff going on the ship. It's a kind of two-way thing, isn't it? You can't really have either or. And I think it's for those wanting to be involved or find out a bit more, there's many opportunities. I know. Obviously, Mike as a pediatric. Are you a surgeon, Mike, or a
So
pediatric
I'm not a
surgeon?
surgeon. No,
Okay.
my actual training is I'm actually a GP by trade, but I
Okay.
have a sort of a tropical medicine special interest, and then also a pediatric special
Okay.
interest as well.
That's great. That's
So I've
great.
done qualifications so in the UK you have the Royal College, which is sort of what accredits you as a
Of
specialist. So
course.
I've done qualifications with both family practice, as they call it in America, or GP land here, and also pediatrics as well. So I kind of swing between the two of them really.
Yeah, I was far
But
from wanting to
I'm
put you in a
also
box at all, because I don't like boxes. But I
Mhm,
was just, for those out there, there are so many roles that people can get involved with, from
mhm.
being a medical background, practitioner, to kind of everything from communications to engineering. You name it. A town needs everything, and that's
Oh
what
yeah.
is involved in the Mercy Ships. And I've currently got a few friends on there at the moment, and
Mhm,
hearing live testimonies of what's going on, it's truly magnificent. So yeah, moving on from Mercy Ships, we're moving slightly down the coast now, Senegal
mhm.
to Sierra Leone, another amazing country, linked down the coast, which is neighboring, jumping over Guinea, and neighboring straight into it is Liberia. And yeah, so tell me a bit about your involvement in Liberia. I know you mentioned already in the kind of overview about the ELWA, the hospital there,
Mhm.
and the site. Of course, it's a huge
Yeah.
base run by a few organizations. But tell me about kind of the key areas that you're working in there, Mike, and also some maybe 1 or 2 case studies of some of the cases that you've seen there.
Yeah. So I mean, my role at ELWA has kind of morphed and changed quite a lot over the years. So arrived right towards the end of January 2019. So we're coming up on 6 years now this month of being involved there. And we arrived through serving in mission. That was the organization we came through originally from the UK. And when we got to Liberia, we had a sort of month of kind of orienting, and then you go in, basically went into the hospital. Sort of in my mind was this idea that we would do pediatric things because that's kind of what I was used to in Sierra Leone, and I kind of figured out how to establish pediatric wards and malnutrition programs and knew how to do that. So I got there, and originally when I got to the hospital, I was really quite shocked because there was a pediatric ward. It was beautifully laid out. There was only about 16 beds, and there were hardly any children on it. And I remember thinking this makes no sense because this country, I know the child mortality rates, I know the medical needs, I know the malnutrition thing. I've done all my research, I'd seen the country already. And you've got a peds ward here that's virtually empty, trying to figure out, well, what's happened here? What's gone wrong? And what had happened was essentially the entire hospital was running on a kind of a fee for service basis. So anybody, in order to get in, had to pay quite substantial fees. So in order to even get onto the pediatric ward at the time, somebody had to pay $75 to do that. Now, most families, that's their entire month's wages. So they just wouldn't come. They just didn't have the money up front. So all the way through March, Bethany and I were kind of in this wrestling match of, do we stay here and try to do something about this? Or do we just say, well, this isn't for us. This is not really serving the poor. We don't really feel that this is something we can be part of. And we sort of came to the conclusion that we would try. And we had a loose partnership with the health board in Swansea. So in the UK, health is divided into health boards. And Swansea historically had a link with Sierra Leone, but the work they were doing in Sierra Leone had been taken on by other organizations and wasn't really needed anymore. So there was this pile of funding sitting there. And we were able to basically access it and reroute it to Liberia. And we did a deal with the hospital at the time, which meant that we were able to drastically reduce the cost to patients in exchange for the hospital getting a lot of that money from Swansea to buy the medicine, to pay some of the staff. And that in April of 2019, April the 29th in 2019, kind of launched the Under 5 program. And by the end of May, the ward was totally full. And it just kind of expanded.
Wow.
And then in July, it's got even bigger in July because the Ministry of Health approached us and said, well, we want to run malnutrition programs. We've tried it in a couple of places. We've had mixed results. We can see you guys have started something. How do you feel about it? And we had some negotiations. And in the end, there was an agreement made that for malnourished children, so they had to meet the World Health Organization categories for severe acute malnutrition. They met those criteria, those children would be treated for free. And again, there was funding that came in from Swansea for that. And the program was kind of ticking along at a fairly not terribly busy level all the way through 2019. And then towards the end of 2019, we were struggling a bit. We're starting to run out of money. We'd got a few churches and people on board in the UK, but it wasn't really enough to keep it going. And the big thing we were struggling with was something called plumpy nut. So plumpy nut is a malnutrition kind of peanut paste that you use for outpatient feeding. And if you're running a nutrition program, you use vast quantities of this stuff, carton after carton.
I actually heard of that and came across it for the first time when I was in Liberia meeting Louise, who's part of the team there on the ward.
Yeah,
Now, Louise was telling me all about the plumpy nut and this process. So yeah, fascinated to hear more about that. Right.
Yeah, that's it. So the plumpy nut is basically each packet has 500 calories. It's very calorie dense. It's very accessible for children. And we're just struggling to source it. I mean, there wasn't enough in the country, and various reasons and idiosyncrasies meant we were struggling to get it. And then these guys from an organization called Live 2540, based in Georgia in the US, basically said, we're going to try and find you plumpy nut. I didn't think they'd be able to do it. But then I got this call from someone. They said, well, we found a pile of it in Guinea, and they've been shipping it in. And then once they started doing that, it was really like a cascade effect because we were able to vastly increase our outpatient presence. And then more children came on bed from that to be admitted. And then that caught the eye of an organization called Samaritan's Purse, who basically said, well, there's something going on here. We should try and get behind this. So they've been involved since 2020. They got involved really as part of they had some funding to help with COVID. And really, because COVID basically destroyed the economy in Liberia, it pushed a
I was just about to say that, within all this, you've got literally the recovery of Ebola. You've got then COVID-19,
Oh yeah.
and then you've got all this in the mix as well. People, just so people are aware, this is like Ebola started basically in Liberia,
Mhm.
and actually on the very site pretty much, and then of course you've then got the COVID-19 coming in around this very time, 2019, 2020, and yeah, then you've got shortages of all these um, products that are needed to keep children alive. With being in West Africa as well, all these such a myriad of kind of factors that make it really hard to kind of build things.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot going on. And I think, yeah, I mean, the main thing with COVID, I mean, we had patients with COVID coming to Elwa and we had a response. And really, during kind of right before COVID, we were really struggling in terms of our personnel at Elwa. So I got thrown into the role of being chief medical officer as well. So it was absolute
So
chaos.
many hats, Mike.
Well,
So many hats.
somewhat too many hats. So I mean, I did it for a best part of a year and sort of got us through the first 5 months of COVID, but barely slept really. It was just intense. And we had a COVID, we called it the respiratory ward. So any patient who may have had COVID went over this. We had a lot of COVID patients, but the biggest damage was the economy and the poverty rates, and things just got worse. So we had loads more children coming with severe acute malnutrition, and that kind of really caused absolute chaos. And that's how actually Samaritan's Purse basically said, well, we can see the biggest impact of COVID seems to be on malnutrition rates. Let's try and help you guys out. And when they did that, we were able to basically get up to 16 beds on the PEDS ward that were just for malnutrition. And then there's another 6 for newborns, and then another kind of dozen or so for just everybody else. And then we set up a little pediatric space in the emergency room. And once that started, essentially a network of partners kind of came out of the woodwork. So there's a group called Canada Reformed Relief. They started helping. A group called My Local Doc in Australia. A bunch of missionary kids from Elwa occasionally get involved and start helping. And there's all sorts of people kind of got involved once Live 2540 and Samaritan's Purse kind of opened the doors for that, really. So that's the Elwa side of it. And what we
That's amazing.
noticed, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's intense, it's exhausting. I mean, Elwa is by default the biggest malnutrition program in Liberia. We didn't set out to be that way, but just other things have struggled and closed, and we've just had more and more children coming. But what we noticed,
Just to Mike, sorry,
yeah,
just to jump in, just to give people a bit of context with Liberia and Monrovia. There's around 5.5, 6 million people
yeah,
in Liberia itself, and actually probably 4 million of those live around Monrovia, which is actually not made for that that number of people. The infrastructure, as you'll
mhm,
know, and having been there myself as well, it's not really in a great developed state to be holding that many people. So from that, then there's so many issues arising, and then of course,
right.
the road system in Liberia making it very hard for people to get around. All this, there's so many challenges, aren't there? We could do probably a whole podcast on the challenges of Liberia, but I just wanted to give people a bit of that snapshot context for that. But on top of that, there's the economy obviously that doesn't help with this malnutrition, but also from my time there speaking to people, understanding that because of the civil war, because of the COVID outbreak and obviously Ebola as well, this country has been battered by
Yes.
attrition for many years, 20, 30 years, and beyond. And actually, that's meant that you've lost a huge gap of education to people, both in literacy, but also in medical understanding, etc., and all this. So you've got people who are actually the median age, from what I understand, is 19, 20 years old across the
Hmm.
country. And that obviously has a huge knock-on effect on people's education and their impact to bring up children. And I heard a crazy story when I was actually visiting some of the places in Monrovia, where there was some ladies who were struggling to breastfeed because they didn't really know what to do. And of course, their grandmother had passed on, their mother had passed on, and they didn't have that natural follow on of kind of word of
Hmm.
mouth knowledge that's been passed on. And so, coming from rural areas, this is obviously one of the things that leads to some of these huge issues. So I just wanted to give a
Yeah.
bit of context there, which, yeah, you've obviously seen lots of as well in these various countries you've worked in. Moving on to Live 2540, another amazing
Mm.
organization. Tell us a bit more
Yeah.
about that, Mike. And I actually had the privilege to visit the amazing new hospital that was launched a few weeks before I
Mm,
arrived, and yeah, it was amazing to see. We missed each other by a few days, but I'd love to
we
hear
did,
a bit
yeah.
of the story, a bit of story around the hospital and the Jesus Loves
Yeah.
Me Hospital.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, really, Live 2540, our relationship with them started around Plum Peanut, but they Live 2540 still supports Elwer as well. I mean, they sponsor surgeries there, they support things like the utility bill, they help with our newborn care space. A huge blessing to ELWA just to start with. But what was going on throughout 2020 and into 2021 is we started to notice a lot of children coming down from a town called Banga, which is 4 hours in the interior. And we had some conversations with some of the people up there. There's a couple of missionary people up there. There's a lady called Susie McClay, who's a New Zealand missionary lady. And there was a guy called Don, who's a pastor from the US. And we basically just got talking and said, well, what's going on up there? How come there's so many children coming from there? And they basically said, well, come and have a look. And so I went up there, I think it would be towards the end of 2020, just to see, well, what's going on up here, and kind of stumbled into the most incredibly beautiful ministry that you'll ever see in Liberia. A little group called His Safe Haven, which is a foster home, essentially, group of foster homes for children with disabilities who've been abandoned by their biological families. And there's these little homes where Liberian mums kind of adopt them along with their own children, and they get fed, they get taken care of. They have all these kind of play therapy. It's just incredibly beautiful. And on the back of that was running a small medical clinic, just a very small thing, but seeing huge numbers of children, seeing over 100 children a day in this room that was maybe half the size of our house here in Wales. And they were sending the sicker ones down to ELWA, obviously, because they couldn't do inpatient care. And so from there, Dawn and myself and Live 2540 were already supporting some of the work up there. We all just started having conversations about, well, what would it look like to have some kind of clinic or hospital or something bigger up in Banga in Bong County, specifically for children? And I basically ended up drawing a little diagram. So I got that, as you do, the back of an envelope and drew out.
It always starts on a little
Yeah,
diagram, doesn't it?
and there was a 5 room thing that I drew out, and I sort of took a picture on WhatsApp and sent it to Don, and then over to Darryl Roberts. So Darryl Roberts was the founder and president of Live 2540, and I think he showed it to some of their board. And then Susie had a look at it. Everyone has a look at it, and they basically said, "Well, Mikey, this is way too small. Like, we need to believe for something bigger here." And Don just kind of looked and said, "We have a big God," and just kind of basically said, "Redraw it." So all through 2021, there was this kind of design process of trying to figure out, well, what would this look like? And other people got involved. People started saying things like, well, how would it look to have maternal health in the future? Let's plan for that. What about if we want to do surgical camps? Let's plan for that. So the discussions went on. And then incredibly, a guy called Daryl Bile, who's an engineer from Montana in the US,
Yes, what a
he
guy.
just, yeah,
What a guy.
incredible guy. He just turns up on a 2 week site visit to basically give us some direction, because there was Susie and Dawn and myself just kind of looking at this going, well, we don't really know what we're doing with construction. Like, I know how this is supposed to look, but I got no idea like what kind of bricks, what kind of windows, how to organize construction crew. I got no clue what I'm doing here. And Daryl was hilarious. He took a look at us, and he was there for 2 weeks, and he kind of looked at us fumbling around. He must have thought we were hilarious as like a professional engineer. And he just kind of says, like, you guys need some help. I'll stay till it's done. And he kind of just parked himself out there and has been just getting this thing done. And you look at it now, and it's almost like an upside down Noah's Ark. If you look at the design, it's a humongous thing. It's over 100 meters long. It's
Yeah.
massive. I mean, that was just a pile of mud with a bit of a swamp next to it 3 years ago. You go back, and that's all it was.
Yeah. One
And
of the things I was blown
yeah,
away by was, so I was, yeah, really honored to meet yeah, Susie and the other guys, Darren and Daryl as well, of course. And Daryl spent about an hour. We walked around, and he was showing me the reason for certain design criteria and the solar farm and the design of the building. And actually, for those who know Liberia, know that it gets extremely hot and humid. And I having traveled a lot of Africa, I know what that's like. But for a lot of people, it's pretty hostile environment for if you're coming into it from the Western world. And actually, one of the things Daryl was telling me was that this design of this roof that he'd kind of worked on actually there were some people complaining that it was too cold in the hospital.
Yes.
And I found that absolutely hilarious because, of course, that's the one thing you kind of really desire in West Africa. A bit
Mm,
more. You pay so much for AC, and in fact, that's why the solar farm is so amazing in that it generates so much
mm,
electricity for the hospital there. But I remember one of the vivid memories was being in devotion at the hospital in the morning there. Just very very touching, seeing all the staff there, very local, all from the local area. But then on top of that, I think they were just finishing off some of the walls and the kind of security tower and stuff, and then we walked down this kind of outside fence, and there were like two snakes just on the ground that had been said goodbye to previous nights, and I was just like, wow, yeah, it's not just the actual physical malnutrition and the diseases. It's actually there's so many other things that are at play in
yeah.
West Africa that people need to be aware of, and so just so many things to battle. But yeah, the hospital, absolutely phenomenal place, and again, like Mike, it's these people bringing their expertise.
Mm,
We bring what we have, and one things we haven't really touched on, which I really do want to
mm,
just hear your story on is of course faith. And we talk about why we're in these countries, why we're traveling around, and of course, adventure is in our DNA. We're called to explore, we're called to, find out about these places, but ultimately, there's a bigger reason why we're in these places, and actually,
mm.
that's for me anyway. It's about sharing the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ to others, and
Sure.
be it sharing the hope that we have with others, and being able to give a reason for that. So for you, Mike, we're talking here about the Christian faith, by the way, for those who are joining or listening who aren't aware of that. I'm a Christian. You'll all probably know that from previous episodes, and that shapes my worldview entirely.
Mm.
And Mike, is that, I'm assuming, but I don't want to assume anything. I'm assuming that is an aspect of why you've
Yeah.
gone to these places and the live 2540. Tell us a bit about that, and tell us a bit about
Yeah.
your story, and also how that plays into all this.
Sure. I mean, I'll start. I guess I'll start slightly backwards on that. In that, when you look at the sort of hospitals, I mean, I'll start with Live 2540. I mean, the name there's a clue in the name. It comes from a Bible verse, Matthew 25:40. Whatever you've done for the least of these, and that has been the sort of compelling drive here through a lot of what I do is, what are we doing for the people who can't give us a reward? Uh, what are we doing for the people who can't pay? What are we doing for the people who can't actually kind of give us anything in return? Like, we're not going to get any recognition or medals or money or anything for this, but we're doing it anyway. And there's a whole reason behind that. And then you come back to the title of the second hospital, the Jesus Loves Me Children's Center, as we call it. Um, and
It could be more. It couldn't be more direct, could it? Really?
it's pretty blatant, isn't it? I mean, it's there. But the reason we do it that way is the whole concept. For me, what's most compelling about Christianity is the concept of unconditional love. So the idea, if you look at every religion, or majority of religions, there's a sort of a goes around, comes around kind of mindset, isn't there? There's well, if I do good, then good will probably happen to me. If I do bad, then bad will probably happen. And you see that theme is sort of in the Bible, but then in the middle of that, you have the person of Jesus Christ who comes in and basically gives everything. He gives his life for us, for you and me, despite the fact that we're never going to repay that. Even if I give my life to this work, that's still nothing compared to what Jesus Christ has done for me in giving his life. And so, really, the outworking of that is Matthew 25:40. It is Jesus loves me. It's saying, well, we're going to go and we're going to seek out the poorest children, the people who will never be able to pay, they'll never be able to give us anything back. They're never going to be able to kind of give us recognition. They're not going to be on Facebook. They're not going to be anywhere giving us recognition, but we're going to do it anyway. And we're just going to do it and not expect anything in return. And the reason for that is because one time, I believe very strongly 2000 years ago, someone hung on a cross for me and did that. Despite the fact that I'm going to get stuff wrong, I'm going to mess up, I'm going to fall flat in my face, I'm going to make all sorts of mistakes, and I still do. But Jesus is still there going, well, I love you, Mikey.
Mm.
And I think there's that offer for anyone. I mean, I think one of the problems is sometimes with the whole kind of faith discussions is a lot of the time it gets into camps, and it's like, well, those are the Christians over there, those are the Muslims over there, those are the, the heathens over there. And actually, you don't really see that with Jesus. What you see is him going out and looking for people. And there's a whole sort of lost sheep, the 99 people there and the 99 sheep even. And he's like, well, one of them isn't here. Let me go find them. And then you see he's eating and drinking with tax collectors, all the people you wouldn't expect to see the savior of the world eating and drinking with. And that's
Exactly.
something I always, whenever I'm talking about faith with people, I always try and encourage them. Like people, someone says to me, oh, I can't go to your church because I'll get hit by a bolt of lightning. I think, well, what? No, that's so wrong. Like God isn't there ready to hit you with a bolt of lightning. He's there with his arms open saying, come in, come in. I want to know you. I want to, you were made to know your creator. And rather than having this constant fear of, oh no, what have I done? It's actually God knows. It's like, yeah, I know that probably this week you've done stuff that isn't right. Still love you anyway.
Mm.
Let's come in.
I think
Let's have a chat about it. So
that's a great point. And I think the thing I often say to people is, when you get to know someone, what do? You ask them questions, don't you? And I
oh
say,
yeah.
if there's things that you want to know about God, then ask him. And that's, a lot of this podcast and a lot of the conversations I have are with people asking those very questions. What is it? What is the meaning of life? Is there evidence for the resurrection? Is there, did Jesus do the things that he said he did? And what are the implications of that? And of course, there are
Oh yeah.
grave implications, great positive and negative. So, yeah, I think asking those questions and getting to know, the person who, like Jesus, the person of Jesus, like you would want to get to know anyone, is of infinite importance. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, that's amazing. Like, and of course, your faith. Then obviously that's worked out in your work at the moment. But you could have obviously done that anywhere in the world. Of course, there's need anywhere in the world. How does your work in Liberia and Senegal and Sierra Leone and other places? How is that different to the work when you're in Wales? What's the difference? And just give people a snapshot of
Yeah.
Wales to West Africa. What's the key differences?
Vastly different. I mean, the first thing I would say is I love my work in Wales as well. I mean, I have
Yeah,
the opportunity to work with some wonderful people, and I work in the 111 service. I work with a hospital at home service called the acute clinical team. I work in the medical school in Cardiff and occasionally in a practice in Llanelli. I love all those people. It's great work, and especially, I mean, the acute clinical team is a beautiful team to be part of. Very supportive, and I love it. But I think there's a number of differences. I think maybe we come back to philosophically, really, in that when I'm working in the UK, I'm paid a salary. I'm reasonably well paid. So there is that difference. Whereas Liberia is an entirely unpaid thing. I mean, I do this voluntarily. So the work I do in the UK essentially funds family stuff, and it funds all the stuff that I do in Liberia. So there's that, but also the need in Liberia is just so much bigger. I mean, if you mentioned the median age being 19, half the population is under 16 in Liberia. Uh, and the reality of that is because of the higher mortality rate, and it's skewed because the child mortality rate, the under five mortality, something like 1 in 10 don't make it to their fifth birthday. I think it's probably higher because there's a lot of unreported stuff. So there's an urgency about what's going on in Liberia. There's a lack of doctors. You mentioned 5.5 million people in Liberia. Um, there's maybe about 500 doctors for the entire country. In the UK, if I don't turn up for a locum shift, somebody else will fill that gap. In Liberia, if I don't turn up, there's not going to be somebody else to just kind of jump in and start doing stuff. Or there may be, but it puts a huge strain on the system. I mean, when I was at ELWA, first weekend I was there, Saturday morning, my ward round was 63 children, plus new ones coming in through the emergency room. Just exhausting. So I have to really, I mean, I kind of get myself in shape when I get out to Liberia. I don't, I mean, when I'm out there, there's a number of things I do. Like I go to bed really early because I know I need the energy to get through the day. I have my coffee on the go. I totally sign off any alcohol when I'm out there. I just need all my energy just to go through it. And because it's exhausting, and the children are sick. I mean, you're talking children coming not breathing, children coming with all the signs of shock, children in comas, extremely sick. And as a sort of a GP with a pediatric subspecialty, I kind of end up being the most qualified person there, which it's not a boast about my ability, it's a reflection on the strain on the system. So
Yeah,
whereas in the UK, I always have a backup of hospital consultants, and there's always people who I can refer to and get advice from, and all of that kind of stuff. In Liberia, that doesn't exist, and you have some really tough situations. You'll often encounter, I mean, children with cancer, hardly hardly any really real success treating them out there because we often just don't have the environment and the medicine, and it's those kind of things are really, really hard. So we get into mindset out there, let's just do what we can. Let's treat the straightforward stuff as best as we can. And when I say straightforward, they're really sick, but at the same time, the treatment protocols are quite straightforward and quite prescriptive.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
malnutrition, barely in Wales, barely see malnourished children, barely. Whereas out there, you're looking at 1 in 3 children meets the criteria for some kind of malnutrition. It's a huge, huge number. So
yeah. No, it
different
is,
way.
it is, it is crazy. So it's fascinating just to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I heard similar things in other medical practices as well. You know, from obviously the max fax dental area, and then obviously congenital, all areas that are serious. You know, these cases happen all over the world, but it's just there's some areas where either they're presented so late, they then end up being so horrific and so bad and so hard to sort out. And all that, of course, we look back and how's that happened? A lot of it's education. It's the environment that they're in. It's actually in many cases no fault of their own. Whereas you look at some of the the more developed countries in the world, and you could draw other kind of outcomes from that. But I think yeah, it's fascinating and really just helpful for people to understand that this is something that is done out of out of a call. People in kind of Christianity would say they have a call to something.
Mhm.
Some people would term that as where your heart's most desire and the world's utmost needs meet. But I think that really fits with you know what you've just shared there, Mike, in terms of your gifting, and also where there's a huge need. So hats off to that, and I think listeners will just be fascinated to understand that concept. You mentioned something interesting in the last few minutes about how you keep fit, how you stay mentally on it, and obviously coffee is a huge thing. I'm a bit of a coffee passionate aspirado
Sure.
myself, so we can definitely next time we meet in the flesh we can enjoy some good coffee. But yeah, you mentioned about you've mentioned to me off this conversation about your running, and in fact, one of the stories that was told to me by someone out there was that Mike came to Liberia and actually entered the Liberian marathon and then ended up winning it without even realizing it. So tell that was an amazing story. I wanted
Oh,
just to
yeah,
pick your brain on. Of course, one of
sure.
the hardest countries in the world to run in itself. You ended up doing pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun actually. It was very, very, very interesting. I mean, I've done the Sierra Leone Marathon, I think 3 times now, and the best I ever positioned there was fourth. But so Liberia, I always run round around the ELWA compound. So back in 2022, and our son Finley was kind of he was 6, 7 months old when we moved out there. So I would do most of my training early in the morning. He'd wake up at 4:30 or 5, just crying, unable to sleep. So I would stick him in the pram and push him round and round ELWA compound. There's this kind of 2 mile loop that you can do. And that was most of my training, pushing Finley round and round and round in the pram, trying to get him to stop crying and at least enjoy his life a little bit. And so I get to the start of this marathon, and it's 6 o'clock. There was a half marathon and a 10K running at the same time. And there's only about, I don't know, 70 people at the start of the marathon. And I'm all there. I've got my little Swansea Harriers. I run with Swansea Harriers in the UK. I got my little vest on, and there's people of all sorts there, Liberians and internationals. And I start going, and with
But the one thing you didn't have is you didn't have your pram in front of you. So you'd done the hard training. You'd done the hard training
yeah,
with your
I
son.
like to think that helped me. Yeah, I like to think it did. So 2 miles in, I get to this point where I realize there's a group of about a dozen runners who've shot off way in the distance, and I can just about pick them out in the distance. And I think, oh my goodness, this is a disaster. There's some proper pros turned up here from, I don't know, Kenya or Ethiopia or something, and I'm not even sure I should have entered this. So I'm going along, and then get to about 4 or 5 miles in, and a bunch of them all dropped out. They didn't realize the marathon was 26.2 miles. So I thought, okay, all right, this isn't so bad after all. I might catch one or two people. They're sort of plodding along, and the signposting left a bit to be desired. Running around, and basically just end up asking locals at various points, did you see runners? You see runners? They go that way. And they, oh yeah, that way. Keep going, white man. And so I get to about 15 miles, overtake a couple more guys. And
Amazing.
as I get to about sort of 20 miles, basically running, there's a big hill sort of with a Capitol building on, you run down it, and I actually feel really good. And I had one of my little powder coffee things, so I got it out and tried to just drink it straight from the packet. Never do that. Tasted awful. And ended up almost vomiting and just pulling over for about a minute. And then I kind of got going again and picked off a couple more guys, and there were like two guys ahead of me, Sierra Leoneans. I thought, oh, they're going to be serious, and they were good runners. I kind of had run with them in Sierra Leone Marathon before, and I sort of came alongside one of them. He was really struggling, so I overtook him. Overtook the next guy, and I thought, oh, there's probably a bunch of guys who've already finished by now, about 24 miles into this. And then alongside me comes this motorbike and this car with flashing lights. And I thought, oh no, like I've
What
broken
have
the
I
rule,
done?
pull me over. They're gonna just, they're gonna wonder why is it this white guy here running in the middle of all this. And I'm running along, and then about 25 miles in, about a mile and a bit to go, I hear them shouting, "It's the first winner!" And I'm like, "Seriously, I'm winning this thing!" So I get to the last mile, and it just becomes sort of an all-out, hang on in there, sprint as hard as you can,
Don't
get
look back,
to the
run for your
line,
life.
and
Wow,
yeah, just sort of stumble across it and just end up passing out, just well, not totally passing out, falling over in the stadium.
amazing,
Like I won this
amazing.
thing.
So
That was
they finish at the SKD Stadium, do they,
They do,
in
yeah.
the middle there? Great.
Fantastic
Yeah.
venue to finish it. I mean, the
Yeah.
atmosphere coming into the stadium was second to none. There were loads of people watching, and yeah, and then the award ceremony, everything went on for about 4 hours. So just spent the entire day kind of
Wow.
cooking in the sun, trying to rehydrate. Uh, Great fun, but
Amazing,
intense.
amazing. I mean, for those who aren't aware, and who haven't been to Africa or West Africa, indeed, it's the roads are not what you would be expecting roads to be like for a marathon in anywhere else in the world. And in fact, if you were to imagine, Kipchoge doing the sub 2 hour in that kind of planned format, that was certainly not what Mike has been running on in Liberia. So just to give a bit of context there, I think from what I've been led to believe and understand is because I was actually there for the marathon this year in 2024. And I mean, there were some areas which they said was the route, and it looked like it was just a bit of a rubble track. So and kind of still cars driving past you. So there wasn't like a laid out route, which was like making it perfect for runners to get their best time ever, PB.
Yeah. So,
But what was your time in the end, Mike, when you finished and when you
so
ran through?
it was really nothing impressive. It's 2 hours 58, 20 something, I think it was,
Cool,
which I mean, I normally like to get close to 240. My PB is 242, which I actually
cool.
ran back in April in the Great Welsh Marathon over in Pembrey, just kind of half an hour from here. So yeah, I mean, you're never, as you said, on those roads in that heat. I mean, it just 6 o'clock it was fine, but then you could feel it literally every mile from about mile 15 onwards, everyone was just getting hotter and hotter and more exposed. And you're never going to run a PB in those conditions. But yeah, to
No,
break 3 hours was good. But I mean, some of the runners I've trained with here in Swansea, they would laugh at that sort of time. Really, these are guys who are doing sort of 2:15s, 2:20s, just
yeah.
they're going, oh, look, I broke 3 hours. It's kind of comical.
Yeah. But then you could also add you did it in Liberia at probably 35 degrees and
Hmm.
90% humidity. So there's grace in that. I think hats off to you, Mark. And another little story I mean I would never do a marathon in that time, but I also love the outdoors. When I was in Liberia, I did the just so happened to be the first Briton to climb the highest mountain in Liberia, which was the UK's
Yeah,
name is
awesome.
Mount Wativi, but the Liberian
Uh-huh.
name of it is Mount Wallagizi. And so I took a team up there of five, four with machetes, one with a shotgun, and scaled. It wasn't again not a huge mountain, 1,500 meters or so, but no one again was first Britain, and no one had done it in at least 5 or 6 years. And the guides who said that they were the guides didn't seem to know really where they were going. They were relying on my GPS and
Mm.
the fact that there was 6 miles of jungle. that had to be slashed through in front for around 8 hours, made it incredibly challenging. Not because of the height, but because of the temperature and the kind of dense forest we were in. But that was another example of, you know, running and climbing. Maybe another temperate climates or other climates would be more desirable, but it was the temperature that really had an impact there as well. But, you know, I think talking about positives, Liberia, you know, personally, I think there are amazing positives. There are such huge potential in that country, and the nature, the wildlife. You know, certainly where I was in the more remote areas up in the north, near Voinjama, was absolutely stunning. And you know, it's untouched. There are so many areas that are untouched, and of course, many of the population live in Monrovia because of the, you know, economic capital it is, and of course for healthcare and other things. But it is a stunning country, and yeah, I'd highly recommend, if people do get a chance, to not write it off and explore it and take that chance, getting out there. Mike, it's been amazing to kind of hear some of those stories and some of the areas that you're working on. How can people connect if they want to connect with you? We'll obviously put links into the description wherever this has been shared. So of course the organizations, do you want to maybe mention a few more and their links, and then also if people wanted to get in touch with you, of course, how they could do that?
Sure. So I mean, there's essentially three projects I'm involved in Liberia. There's ELWA, which consumes maybe 70% of my bandwidth, and then there's Jesus Loves Me. And then the other thing we haven't got on to, we'll talk about in a minute, maybe, is the ETAP training. But in terms of finding out about Jesus Loves Me, we do have a website. Easiest way to find it is literally just to go to Google, type in Jesus Loves Me Liberia, and the link will come up. And really, I think being involved, praying for it, supporting it. I mean, the big thing we're doing right now is kind of stabilizing and expanding our inpatients. In October, we opened up to inpatient care. We now have 20 beds, so it's small, but we're aiming to get up to 30 by the end of April. We just opened our blood bank this month, and we just officially got registered as an inpatient feeding center with the government this month as well. So those are two huge steps forward.
Amazing.
So having those two things is great, but our next phase really is tuberculosis and HIV treatments, which are going to be key. So I'm hoping that I'm getting out there a week on Saturday. I'll be back out there again. So that's one of my goals, is to start pushing all those things. So once that's going, I think we'll probably be just kind of stabilizing around that, and then maybe once perhaps towards autumn time, we might start doing more outreach clinics kind of from there, with Jesus Loves Me as a hub. But there's a website for that. For ELWA, the easiest way to find out more is elwachildren.com. That's our website. There's a blog which I'll update far more sporadically than I should, but it is a thing there. Tells you all about our different partner organizations, lots of pictures, lots of stuff about what we do, and just generally quite a good resource. So those are the two. And I think ELWA Children has been kind of more developed as a sort of a resource and a way to find out information, just because there's been so many more children coming through there. So that's probably the primary point. And then some of the other organizations, I mean, Live 2540 also have a website as well. So in terms of just hearing about other stuff they're involved in the country, that's a good place to go as well. And then I mean, Samaritan Spurs have a page as well. SIM have a page predominantly focused around ELWA. So there's all sorts of things. But I would start with elwachildren.com and Jesus Loves Me as those kind of two sources.
Fantastic. Well, Mike, really appreciate your time, and it's been fantastic hearing some of the stories of West Africa, and how a man growing up in Senegal ends up back in Wales and then back in West Africa again. It's been awesome, and there's much more to hear from those challenging endeavors. I'm sure many listeners would love to follow up on that. So thanks so much for your time. It's been great chatting. And I have been David Stretton-Downes. This has been the Inside Story podcast, and we look forward to hearing more from you, and more from many other guests on coming episodes in the future. So stay tuned.